Welcome back to a year of Final Fantasy, and we're in the month of Ifrit, and during this month we're taking a brief look at the expanded Final Fantasy VII compilation that began about a decade after the original came out. Last time we talked about Crisis Core for the PSP, which was a prequel to the game, and this time we're going to be talking about Dirge of Cerberus that released on the PlayStation 2. Dirge of Cerberus is a pretty interesting game. It was released on PlayStation 2 in January of 2006 for Japan, and later in the year on August 20th, 2006 for the United States, and a little bit later in November for Europe. Dirge of Cerberus is chronologically the last game to exist in this sort of overarching Final Fantasy VII universe, at least so far. Specifically, it's set after Advent Children and around 3 years after the original Final Fantasy VII game proper. The game focuses on Vincent Valentine, one of the optional characters from Final Fantasy VII, but it's actually one of the most loved characters and a particular fan favorite. The choice was a good one, as the character has unique ties to Shinra and the heroes of the original game, which allows for a bit of a different perspective on the story as a whole in general. Additionally, since Vincent was an optional character, he didn't get a ton of spotlight in the original game, and as such, this allows for a more in-depth look at his character, remedying that issue that players wanted to know more about Vincent. Well, they got it here in spades. Of course, this game is set fairly shortly after Final Fantasy VII and Advent Children, and as such, cameos of the original characters do pop up from time to time, but none are totally, incredibly vital to the main story that we're following with Vincent. So I'm going to compare and contrast this a little bit to Crisis Core, which we talked about last time, so if you haven't seen that, go and check that out. It's not vital, but I will be mentioning it from time to time here. So similarly to Crisis Core, this game was heavily influenced from Nomura's rising stardom in the company, hot off the heels of Kingdom Hearts. Many issues from Crisis Core are felt here as well, and I don't necessarily mean issues in a bad way. It's just the things that we see in Crisis Core, you can see very, very similarly how they made their way into this game as well. But that being said, the overall look and feel of the game is just incredibly similar to Crisis Core and Nomura's style, which we're going to see a lot in the Final Fantasy franchise moving forward. Also, the game, again similar to Crisis Core, was incredibly action heavy. And in fact, this game is the first third-person shooter that Square had ever created, and because of this, there's a lot of mixed reaction to the game, as fans wanted more of a proper Final Fantasy VII sequel than this game allowed them. The fact that this is a third-person shooter cannot be overstated enough, in the fact that this is actually a fully action-based game, unlike Crisis Core, which was an action-based kind of semi-turn-based game. It kind of floated between the lines there. This is a full-blown real-time game, which was a big point of contention with the turn-based RPG fans. Regardless, the action itself is solid, but it's not really scratching that itch that made Final Fantasy VII popular in the first place, even with these sort of hybrid RPG-esque parts of the game like leveling up and things like that. So in general, this game initially sold very well, but lacked in critical ratings really. Much of the critical demise was simply a departure from what people wanted in a Final Fantasy VII sequel, not necessarily that the game that was presented was itself bad. It just didn't hit the mark of expectations from the fans. Of course, as always, some of this has to do with the subjective nature of the story, but we don't really talk about story here on a year of Final Fantasy for the very reason of that I want you to go and play the game and figure out the story for yourself if you like it or if you don't. I don't want to influence you in any way on that particular point. I personally enjoy the story, and I take into account that this is the way that the people that made the game wanted their story to go. It's their project, it's their, ideas, and I want to experience them how they want to present it to us, and that's fine. I actually really enjoy the game for the most part on a story level. Some things that I personally dislike, though, is the inclusion of other characters that were introduced in Crisis Core but were absent from Final Fantasy VII proper, and they come back and appear here in this game. Of course, the real world reason for this is that they're just simply different games made in different times, and honestly have a little bit of a different continuity. But, as a fan, you always want to ask yourself, well, why wasn't this character in Final Fantasy VII if they appeared in Crisis Core, and they're appearing in Dirge of Cerberus, where Crisis Core was a prequel, Dirge of Cerberus was a sequel. But of course, there's a real world answer for that. Anyway, one other thing that I wanted to mention briefly here is that there is a multiplayer feature, and it's quite different from region to region. In fact, many of the game's features were heavily altered to more or less accommodate for a Western audience. Multiplayer was a rather large part of the game in Japan, but due to the lack of play online support here in the States, much of that part of the game was completely reworked into the single player portion. Though online multiplayer didn't exist over here, local multiplayer still did. Other portions of the game that were changed were, for instance, the hard drive support of downloaded missions. Those were incorporated into the game itself, as well as the game removing an easy mode intended to help those role-playing gamers not really familiar with shooter games. Apparently, they thought that the Western audience just loved our shooters and they didn't even really need that mode. I assume maybe whenever they removed it, they got to add some of those DLC missions that we necessarily wouldn't have been privy to, but I can't confirm that one way or the other. Anyway, that's Dirge of Cerberus. It's the last game, like I said, to appear chronologically in the expanded Final Fantasy VII universe, but we definitely are not done there. So stay tuned here in the month of Ifrit for more Final Fantasy VII goodness. As always, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this, please give me a like, maybe even a sub. Otherwise, still appreciate you watching, and as always, until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.